that a huge portion of my sulfite will get bound because of all the leads that I have in my must. I actually double up on my sulfites to begin with on my first edition, knowing that probably 60% of that gets bound up with all the crap in my carboy. And so, and
Is it a fairly clear mead already? Is it fairly clear?
No, I'm talking it's pretty dirty, Tom. In fact, a lot of times I'll do that without have never racked. And so I'm talking about a full-on dirty, batch of mead, and I'll double sulfite. I will sorbate and crash it, and then I'll rack it off the first time, in 5 or 7 or 10 days, whatever time I give to.
So I tend to hold off on the sorbate if it's still pretty dirty, but I'll get to that in a second, why I would hold off on the sorbate until it's clear.
Okay, sure.
But yeah. So it's cloudy and there's leaves and you're waiting to get it done. That's fine. If it had sat on the leaves long enough that it was actually fairly clear, and I was putting it in, I would rack it on the sulfate, and I would increase the amount, but it wouldn't be as much as if it was a cloudy mead I was racking,
right?
And finding. But because you're getting it off of there. But if you're going to have a lot of sediment coming out that you know of because the meat's pretty cloudy, then you would have to even use more than that because a lot of that's going to be lost.
Right.
So then I guess it comes to the point of when do you sulfite? What time, what times during the process of making mead in general do we think about sulfiting? And so another thing I read online is somebody was making a traditional mead and they sulfited it at the beginning before they even put their yeast in there. And it's not really necessary. If you sulfite it and put the yeast right in there, that could actually be a problem. But winemakers will often sulfite their must and then wait 24 hours and then pitch their yeast in.
But the wait 24 hours is kind of key.
That and they sulfite during crush.
And they sulfite during crush, so a lot of that's going to be lost and fairly quickly. The reason why they do that is there may be wild yeast on there and bacteria and mold, and they want to get those maybe not killed off, but stunned enough so that when they put in their selected strain, which is more sulfite resistant than some of the wild strains, they'll be able to just take off and get a head start. I've done that. I had a peach melomel, and the fruit was on the ground, and the yellow jackets were crawling on it, and it was turning brown, and they were really juicy and tasted good. But I was worried that there was going to be some stuff growing on there, so I smushed them and I made the honey must, and then I sulfited that, and then the next day I pitched my yeast, and it did fine. But if you're making a traditional mead, or if you're using like fruit from a can, or just even raw fruit that's really pretty clean, it's not having mold on it, you probably aren't going to have to really do that. That's not really a necessary step. At least I've never done it, and I've not had any problems ever. So then the time when you usually think about it is when you're ready to move the mead from the primary fermentation vessel over to whatever you're going to do for secondary aging. And that's going to because when the yeast is fermenting, it's producing carbon dioxide, and so it's protected by that blanket of CO2. And so it's really once you get it off of there and you rack it, then there's going to be some risk of oxidation because fermentation is no longer going on. And that's usually when I think about my first sulfiting. Usually that's the time I do it. Now I'll do it with further rackings, depending on how often I'm doing them. I will also do it if I'm adding more solids. So let's say I'm going to add a large volume of fruit to the batch, or let's say I've already stabilized it with sorbate, I'm going to be adding some more honey. The solids can absorb the sulfite also, so that would be a time I would think about adding sulfite. Oak could potentially do it, and certainly if you're racking into a barrel, that would be a time to sulfite. If I'm doing something that we know we never are supposed to do, and that is leave our mead in a carboy with excessive headspace for a long period of time, we're never supposed to do that. But I've done it because I was lazy and I didn't bottle and I didn't have any place to put it, and I mean literally it was like a half full of a carboy, and so what I did is first I filled it up with carbon dioxide, which is helpful, but it's still not going to totally take all the oxygen out, and so I would make sure that would be relatively high sulfited to protect it from oxidizing and from any microbial activity like Acetobacter. If you're going to filter it, make sure the meat is protected before you're going to filter it, and then at the very end, before you bottle. You need to make sure the sulfite levels are appropriate for that mead based on its pH, because the sulfite will decline slightly over time, and if it declines too much, the mead could get ruined down the road. If it's a sweet mead that you stabilize with sorbate, it might be stable, but if the sulfite is borderline and then it drops in the bottle, you could have re-fermentation in the bottle, which you don't want. So those are the times when I think about sulfiting. And every batch is slightly different. And that's why it's so hard when someone asks me, what is your recipe? It's really hard. I don't really have a single recipe. I have ideas, and then I just follow them through the process, but they evolve. The mead is a living organism when the yeast is fermenting, and then later it's quote-unquote living. It's not really alive, but the chemistry is changing. It's evolving over time. So those things are all happening, and they don't all happen in the same batch. Even the same recipe with the same ingredients, they're two different things. Like that piment I told you about, the one that is a little bit stinky that I'm going to have to figure out what to do. There's another carboy of the same batch, same ingredients. It doesn't have that. Why? Why was it more in the one than the other? And they fermented in the same vessel, and then I split them, and now they're aging in separate carboys, and one doesn't seem like it has more lees on it. And why is it happening? Because these there's variables we probably don't understand or can't really measure. So every batch is a little different, and it's not like I really have, I can't really tell you, just do this recipe and it's going to turn out the way that I made it, because even if I followed the recipe the same time, it wouldn't turn out the same. So, and that's the same thing with managing sulfites also. The amount you might add for one batch at one time might not be the same with the same recipe, quote unquote, that you're doing the next time you do it. So how do we determine how much sulfites to add? And so it's dependent on pH and a little bit on alcohol and temperature. When you're going to add your sulfite, you might mix it in a little bit of warm water, but you don't want it to be really hot. It's better to be cool, lukewarm or cool, because actually if it's warm, it's going to drive off some of the sulfite gas. And you'll smell it too. You take a nice whiff. You're not going to do that a second time. That's gagging. But the lower the pH, the greater the effectiveness of the sulfite, because there's a higher molecular SO2. And so if your pH is higher, you need more sulfite, and that's why the amount that you'll need will change. And there's calculators online, and they're really good ones. Wine Business Monthly, Winemaker Magazine actually has one of my favorites. And you can use that to determine how much free SO2 do you need to have the desired molecular SO2 based on that pH. Okay, I'm just looking through. So we like to measure our sulfites, and there's different ways of doing that. I use the Vinmetrica system. Do you use that, Ryan? Is that what you have also?
Yes, that's what I have.
Yeah, I love it. And before I had that, I was trying to use I think they're called Titrettes, and they're based on the Ripper method, and they're not really that accurate. I mean, I think they're within plus or minus 10 parts per million, and you can't really use them for anything that's dark, like a red piment or something. I know the commercial folks, you can use like aeration oxidation. It's a little cheaper method of doing it. But I love my Vinmetrica because I can measure not only the SO2 but also the pH. And you kind of need to know both. But some folks just don't have the ability to measure sulfite, like I did, and maybe they're not ready to go crazy with their hobby, the way that I decided to. So sometimes you just have to kind of guess, and you just kind of assume your pH is mid-range, maybe around 3.5 to 3.6, and then I'll feel more comfortable using higher additions early because of binding, and the levels will drop over time, and then maybe a little more conservative later. But there is a formula to calculate this out, or you can just use a calculator. I prefer to use a scale, so I really measure it, but I think like a quarter teaspoon of K-Meta in 5 gallons will give you about 5 parts per million, or 50 parts per million, I think. I don't do it that way. I prefer to, I think that's correct, and I prefer to measure it. And guessing it's not as good as directly measuring, but it's still better to guess and add some than to not add anything at all and have this beautiful mead that you're saving and you open and it's ruined. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it really is really, really sad to have that happen. And I think if you've made mead long enough, it's happened to all of us.
Yeah.
Yep. There's
So
really
one of
not
the
a way.
things
I'm sorry.
What's that?
There's
You
really
can-
not a way
yeah.
that you can protect your meat, and I mean, this is really the only way to do it, right? There's no other ways to preserve meat without sulfites.
There was a prize offered in France, and I can't remember what year. It was a long time ago, maybe in the late 1800s, where they offered $1 million prize or something, or $100,000. I don't know how long ago. It was a long time ago. To whoever could develop a way to preserve wine without using sulfites, and they never could. No one ever claimed the prize because no one ever could figure out exactly a way to preserve mead or wine, because it doesn't just protect against microbes. I mean, if you wanted to do that, you could try pasteurization and things, which that can damage your mead, and you can't really do that, unless you're a big factory. But and then the antioxidant effects, and so they haven't really been able to find a way to preserve this in any way other than using sulfites. And I think I read the amount of sulfites for antioxidant purposes is actually not that high. It's only like 15 or 20 parts per million. But when you need to get up to 40 or 50, that's more for the antimicrobial effects, because some of the microbes are fairly resistant to sulfites, and some of the bad ones, if you sorbated it, they could actually chemically convert that sorbate, and then you could get that geranium flaw.
I've heard once that happens, there's nothing you can do to save that either. So if you're going to use sorbate, use sulfites, and use enough of them.
Absolutely. So one of the other things I read on one of the forums is that somebody was highly sulfiting in active fermentation while it was fermenting, with the goal of killing the yeast and trying to leave some residual sugar because they wanted a semi-sweet mead. And they were going to try to combine it with cold crashing. And I've read that, but remember, our yeast strains are fairly sulfite resistant. I mean, maybe if you had some weak wild yeast, or I have no idea what would happen with bread yeast, but our yeasts are fairly resistant. So you'd have to use a huge amount. I mean, it would be a burnt match bomb, not for exploding, but just, and so I don't recommend that. My method is I ferment to dryness, and then I back sweeten after I have protected with sulfite and sorbate. That's my method, because then I can get exactly dial in the alcohol that I want, and then I can exactly dial in the sweetness that I want, and then I can add acid or tannin to balance that sweetness if I need to. And that's kind of my technique to get a semi-sweet or sweet mead and get exactly where I want to. So I guess that brings us to sorbate now. We've mentioned it, so sulfites and sorbate. And, unless somebody's commercial and they can sterile filter their mead, because there are ways to stop an active fermentation through filtration, but, you have to be a commercial mead maker and have that, the really expensive fancy equipment, which I would love to have someday, but that's another story.
For $30,000, you too can have your mead.
Yeah, that would be so cool. Wouldn't that be the best?
Right.
I mean, I'm happy to have the toys I have now, but I'd love to be able to have a toy like that someday. Maybe I will.
That's a really expensive fridge.
But, so the way that we prevent re-fermentation if there's residual sugar is through sulfite and sorbate. And sorbate's interesting, too. So it was actually discovered in I think the mid-1800s in a tree, so the mountain ash tree. It's the species, or the genus name is Sorbus, and so it was sorbic acid, and it has antifungal and anti-yeast effects, and it will not affect any yeast that's viable or actively fermenting. So that's a misconception too. If it's active, it's not going to stop it, but it basically prevents the yeast from reactivating and starting to ferment again later. The sorbic acid doesn't really have any effect upon bacteria, some bacteria, but not many. But the wrong bacteria, it can actually cause it to get that geranium fault, and so that could happen later also. So if you didn't put sulfites in there, and you have some of these lactic acid bacteria that are in your mead that you don't know about, it could actually develop later on while it's in the bottle and you don't even know about it. And the thing about sorbic acid, it's more effective when your pH is lower, but once you get into wine pHs, then it's pretty much 90% effective. And if you add too much sorbate, you can actually detect it. Some people can detect it around 150, I think 150 parts per million. I actually haven't tried to